The thing about a story we all know is that sometimes it's hard to remember the truth in it. Jenny's room was tidy, if not clean. It wasn't perfect, but compared to her little brother Mark's room, it was fantastic. Mark's room was analogous to the current state of American politics. Dirty, and depending on where you look, disgusting. Mark and Jenny were only a year apart, but they were so different. Where Jenny was on time, Mark was late. Where Jenny got A's, Mark got by. Where Jenny helped with the family restaurant, Mark slept. And so Jenny spent much of her childhood frustrated by her younger brother. In fairness, her parents did what they could. There were some years that he spent more weeks grounded than not. But in the end, it just didn't seem to faze Mark. He just didn't seem to care. When he was 12 years old, he stopped going to church with the family because he didn't see the point and the minister was so boring. We know the feeling. When he was 13, he refused to go on family vacations because he didn't want to spend a whole week away from his friends. When Mark was 14 and Jenny was 15, their parents called a family meeting and gathered around to excitedly tell them that they had made the decision to put the family restaurant in their whole family's name so that they would always have a share in the family business. They told them it wouldn't kick in until they were 18, but they would always have a place to call home. Mark said that he would rather die than spend his life smelling like grease. Jenny just said, "Thank you." As they grew older, Mark grew further and further away from his family. By the time he was 16, he virtually never left his room. He did leave for his mother's funeral, but he went right back in. That was the start of a dark time for their family. Their dad struggled. Mark, who had never been a candidate for a perfect attendance award, stopped going to school altogether. And his dad stopped arguing. Sure, he would put up a fight for a little while, but eventually he'd just throw up his hands and let it go. Sometimes in life, that's just easier. Plus, he had Jenny. Jenny had picked up right where her mother had left off. She delayed going to college so that she could help out with the restaurant to keep things going in her mother's absence. And within just a couple of months of her mother's death, she was making it work. She was hiring new employees, supervising the waitstaff, managing the payroll, and she was making it work. It was hard and the days were long and she was working her fingers to the bone, but they were getting by. The day he turned 18, Jenny and their father threw a dinner for Mark. They made his favorite meal. Jenny even managed to figure out how to bake the cake that their mother had made them every birthday of their lives. But Mark never came home that night. And Jenny and her father stayed up all night. They were calling and they're texting and longing to hear from their son, but didn't hear a peep. They were worried that they had just lost their mother, and now they were going to lose Mark. The next morning, Mark came home and was not in a good way. His father demanded that he tell him where he had been the evening before, but Mark just said, "Dad, I'm 18 now. I don't have to tell you where I'm going." Mark's dad said to him, "Well, if you're going to live in this house, son, under this roof, you're going to have to learn to respect this family." But Mark just went to his room, and Jenny went to work. That night, after Mark had slept off the festivities of the evening before and was preparing to head out for a little more, he announced to his father and to Jenny that he would be moving out of the house soon. His father said to him, "How do you think you're going to do that?" Confused, he said, "You don't have any money. You haven't even finished high school. Where are you going to go?" And Mark just said to his dad, "Dad, I'm 18 now. I'm ready for my share of the family business." His dad was dumbstruck. But Jenny was obstinate. She began in right away. "How could you do this, Mark? Do you know what it's like to have you as a brother? Do you know what it's like to defend you to the neighborhood? Do you know what it's like?" But before she could finish, her father just stepped in and said, "Jenny, let it go. Mark, your mother and I wanted you to have this, and so you will." Jenny, who had been managing the books, said to her dad, "Dad, we don't have enough money. How are we going to do this? The business will close. We can't do this. How dare him?" But her father just said, "I made a promise, and I plan to keep it." And so the next morning, he went to the bank. He mortgaged his house and his restaurant, and he put up whatever collateral he could find. And he had a check cut for his son. Mark left the next day. Jenny stayed behind. Mark bought a ticket for Europe. He went around, saw some of the most beautiful sights in the world, met some of the most interesting people, and he did whatever he wanted with whomever he wanted for however long he wanted. Jenny let go of half the waitstaff, started cutting orders, and took on a part-time job in order to pay off the family debt. And that's the way the next year went. Mark saw Cairo. Jenny avoided a pyramid scheme. Mark tried mushrooms. Jenny cut them from the menu. Mark bought whatever he wanted. Jenny saved all she could. But eventually, things changed. Jenny found her way, and Mark lost it. As so often happens when we spend all of our time and our money on ourselves. Eventually, Mark was brought up short. He ran out of money somewhere in Eastern Europe, and he didn't know what to do. He was kicked out of the hostel he was staying in and immediately forced into a much more hostile environment. He spent a week on the streets begging for food, looking for any kind of sustenance, either for his stomach or for his soul. Finally, someone pointed him to a shelter, but it didn't have food. And so he spent his days begging and looking for some kind of work, something that he could do to earn his way, to make his way in this world. He stood online with some day laborers for several days before he and a bunch of others were finally picked up. They were loaded onto the back of a pickup truck and driven to the edge of town where they were put to work in the city dump. He was hauling around people's trash for the next month and a half. He reeked of refuse and didn't even make enough to have a full meal. And every day he grew hungrier and hungrier and hungrier, until finally one day he was moving a pile of refuse and he saw an old pizza crust. And he thought, why not? As he took a bite, he remembered his sister and his father and his mother and his shame. He thought of the restaurant, of the pie that they always had ready for anyone who wanted it. He thought of the specials that his dad used to cook up but that he always refused to even try. He thought about what it would be like to just be a waiter on the staff, that at least he would get one meal a day before his shift, and he longed for home. He dreamed of home. He wanted to go home. And so that night, swallowing whatever pride was left, he made a call. He planned out exactly what he was going to say if his father accepted the charges from so far away, but when he finally heard his father's voice, he just broke down into tears. And he couldn't stop. And his father on the other side, thousands of miles away, also began to cry. And he couldn't stop. Until finally he managed to eke out, "Son, come home. I'll get you a plane ticket, just come home." And so he did. The next morning, Mark flew home. And his dad met him at the airport, and Mark immediately broke down. His dad just hugged him, kissed him on the cheek, and couldn't have been happier to see him. Mark said, Dad, I know what I've done. I know how I've been, how miserable I've been. I know what I've put you through, and I'm sorry. But his dad didn't ask him any questions. He just led him to the car. And he took him home and got him in a warm shower and a new pair of clothes. And he said, "Son, I've closed the restaurant for tonight because we are going to throw you a party. And everyone is going to come to celebrate. I've invited everyone from the neighborhood. I've invited the waitstaff and the dishwashers and even the minister from our church." Always a nice gesture. "I've invited everyone I could think to come." And that night, friends, they celebrated. They rejoiced. Except, of course, for Jenny. Jenny, who had never left. Jenny, who had given up so much. Jenny, who had walked with her father through the valley of the shadow of death and brought him out whole on the other side. Jenny, who had given her blood and soul to this restaurant to keep them going. Jenny did not rejoice. How could she? She didn't even know that he was coming back. Her father mentioned that he had a surprise for her. But nothing could have prepared her for when she got out of the car that evening in front of the restaurant and stood on the outside of the glass to see a party for her brother. She felt like she'd been stabbed in the back. She dropped to her knees. She pulled herself into the car, but couldn't pull herself together. She just put her head on the steering wheel and thought to herself, why? Why? I wanted to go see the world. I wanted to date and go to college and do all of these other things, but Mark gets to do that, and I stayed here. I did the right thing. Why? And then she heard the car door open and her father sat down in the passenger seat. And she glared at him. And he said to her, "Come in, Jenny." She said, "How could you do this? I never left. I did everything you ever asked of me. I gave everything that I had. Do you know what other kids my age are doing? You never threw a party for me. But Mark, who has wasted everything he's ever been given in this world, Mark comes back and you kill the fatted calf." But her father just smiled. "Honey," he said, "you are always with me. And everything that is mine is yours." But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost, but has been found. Friends, the beauty and the scandal of grace is that it is for all of us. Which means no matter where we find ourselves on the journey this morning, if we want to go home, the door is open. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Amen.